Hey, everybody. Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. Another history episode of the show today, which means I'm here with my dude, Aris Pina, who is a CompuBox operator and, just a history guy like me. Aris, what up, dude?
What's going on, my friend? It's been a nice little couple of week break. We got a fun show ahead of us today. Um, Regarding what happened this past weekend, the son of a Hall of Famer, Tszyu, made his U.S. debut. And so today we're going to have a fun subject talking about fighters' kids. The offspring that decided to turn pro, from the very best to the very worst.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically this kind of shows like Mark Kriegel's wet dream, dude.
Oh my God, yeah, I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
This is like, but all the Kriegel jokes aside, dude, it's the whole father-son dynamic has been a constant.
Even father-daughter for that matter now.
Yeah, and father-daughter for that matter too. Yeah, I don't want to skip that out. Or I mean, you know what? I didn't even think about it either, but mother-son, mother-daughter, there's a couple of those too. I didn't even consider those. But regardless, point is that whole dynamic of like a parent and a child, their involvement in the sport of boxing, especially with the child being the fighter, the more prominent fighter, that seems to be the case a lot of the time. And that's one of those tropes or stereotypes or whatever in boxing that's a lot of the time it's true, because there's so many examples of it and so many examples of boxing families. And I'm not trying to ignore any boxing families or anything like that, because there are so many. But yeah, that we're going to be bringing up some families, siblings, but mostly just that offspring relationship today, dude. It's a lot to draw from.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with all that being said, what did you think of Tszyu's performance this past weekend?
That's a good question, dude. I thought that he looked pretty good. I thought that
he had a lot of hype behind him. That's the thing. There was a lot of hype, so he had a lot to live up to for his debut, man. Because even though like his fights have been seen on TV and stuff like that, I mean, you could watch them on through Twitter or whatever it is on streaming services. There was still a little bit of an aura of like a question mark with it. The mainstream audience hasn't seen him yet. So
right, yeah, and I mean, I think that at least in part, it's like about half of it is that he's Tszyu's kid, and then the other half is that in Australia, with all due respect to any Australian listeners or anything, I'm not trying to trash Australian boxing in any way whatsoever, but their boxing scene isn't quite as lively as some of like the bigger portions of like bigger cities in the US or something like that, or in the UK. And so when a big potential star comes along, they seem to really get behind them. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of expectation because of that behind Tszyu. And so anyway, you and I, before the fight, you and I had talked, on like a social media messenger and shit privately. And I had mentioned that Tszyu, his lack of head movement was really like a killer for him, and that he ate right hands in a number of fights, like really badly throughout his career.
especially
And that I had hoped that Tszyu had picked up more head movement and a little bit more of that kind of upper body movement, bending at the waist type of thing, than his dad had. And I mean, at least to this point, unfortunately, seems like he kind of hasn't. But there's not really anything wrong with that, in the sense that like he's going to be an exciting fighter. He throws a shitload of punches. He's on your ass. He makes the fight. He's a strong puncher. So I can't see him being anything but like a fun, entertaining fighter. The question, of course, is how far can he possibly go? And that's more open-ended right now. But at this point, who cares? He's obviously very popular in Australia, who will probably continue to be popular. It's going to be a fun fighter. Let's do it, man.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. He struggled early on with Terrell Gaucher. Is it Gaucher? Gaucher? How do you pronounce it?
I think it's Gaucher, but I'm
okay. So
either way, we know who you're talking about.
Yeah, well, he struggled early on. You can tell he, as George Foreman used to always point out on every single fighter, he looks dry. There's no body sweat on him. And Tszyu
got broad shoulders.
Yeah, he came out stiff. He came out really dry. And Gaucher, caught him early on, right there. Like, even though Gaucher is like a lower tier fighter in that division, he's still one of those guys. I don't know if you put him in the gatekeeper status yet, but more or less, he's one of those guys that, like, if you're gonna make it to the top tier, which is a very deep division, consistent of Charlo and Castano and so on and so on. It takes a lot to break through that bunch, and so you got to go through a guy like Terrell Gausha to make it there. Gausha's a former Olympian, tough guy, good skills, good. He's had a good pro career. A little underwhelming, and whenever he's really stepped up, he hasn't quite, he's shown he has a ceiling, right? He's shown where he's at in that division,
right? Yeah,
but he doesn't have a bad placement there. He's still a good fighter. He's never really been blown out. He's been the distance in his losses, and that was exactly the type of Tszyu needed. Like exactly. I said earlier, There was a lot of hype around him early on before that fight. There was a lot of talk, the way he was blowing out guys in Australia and the comparisons to his dad. I mean, he looks just like him. He fights very similar to him. And and the way that cost Tszyu zipped up to become a world champion after, like, what was it, 14, 15, 16 pro fights. He was already in the ring, knocking out Jake Rodriguez before that. He was in the ring, beating guys up like Sammy Fuentes, Livingstone Bramble, Juan Laporte, the list goes on. Like, he was in there with former champions and top guys early. Like, Tszyu was already, but he was also hot-shotted because he was a superstar amateur.
I was going to say, long amateur career at high levels.
Amateur and everything, yeah. His kid, as far as I know, had a really strong amateur career as well. Not quite the level of his dad, but still well enough that when he turned pro, he hasn't been hot-shotted as quickly. He has been developed well. He has fought a slew of, like, veterans and fringe contenders, former contenders, where may it be, and also fought I think he did fight Jeff Horn, didn't he? Or Michael Zephyr, one of those guys.
I want to say Jeff Horn was the fight 2 fights ago, I think.
Okay, so there you go. Like, he's already fought, former champion in Jeff Horn, and he came through that, with flying colors. So there was a lot of attention, especially with him being a top contender now in the ratings, with a potential fight on Charlo on deck, which would be hella exciting. Or Castano, for that matter, too, which another one would be a brutal affair. There was a lot going on, but like I said, he came out very stiff early on. He got dropped, and when he got up, even though you could tell he was more surprised than stunned, he was still, like, stiff in there, and it looked like, I was like, holy shit, this might be like an early night. And if that did, that would have been a laughing stock for everybody, including all the fighters on boxing Twitter who were commenting, hey man, there's too much hype on him, get him, Terrell, like, you can't stand this hype, Everyone was feeling the same thing. So when he got dropped and all that, everyone was like, oh, he's going to be exposed. But to Tszyu's credit, he came back very strongly in that fight. He composed himself. He settled down a little bit. He got his nerves under him. He cleared his head. And once he was able to do that, he got himself into a rhythm. And it worked well for him. Like you said, it's still not a lot of head movement. He got tagged with a ton of right hands. I was counting Gausha that fight. Gausha was very competitive throughout the entire fight. But he's, like, again, he rose through it and he made adjustments and from there, he won a convincing decision. You can't tell me that he didn't win at least 10 of those rounds after getting dropped early on. So,
yeah, I think that there's quite a lot of potential for him with the base that he has. I would be somewhat concerned if I were in his corner in terms of, like you said, he took a lot of right hands, and it's not like many of them were like sneaky right hands. Like, he knew the right hand was coming, like it was coming all night. And so I would be a little bit concerned that he's not moving his head for that kind of stuff. And at this stage in the game, I'm not entirely sure how far you're going to get with teaching head movement, but there are things that you can do to kind of mitigate that somewhat. And from a fan perspective, oh well, it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun to watch. But
he's still young.
Yeah, he's still got a lot of years. So there's a lot of years to develop.
I just hope they don't push him too quickly, because at this moment, from what he showed on Saturday, he could beat a lot of guys in the division. I'm not sure if he's ready for a Charlo yet. It would be fun to watch, but I think Charlo, with the way, he catches his punches, the way he throws power punches, the way he times people and stuff like that, it's, recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it would possibly be real bad, but I think that he could get there. He could potentially get there in a few fights.
Oh, absolutely.
Give him some time.
Yeah, he matches up well with those guys. He matches up well with Lubin. I'd love to see him in with that elastic freak Fundora.
Yeah, totally.
So,
well, speaking of the whole kind of father-son dynamic, getting back to this historical angle here, right? What is, or offspring, sorry, not father-son, but the offspring dynamic. What's kind of a good example, or an example you wanted to bring up?
First one, you got to go with the dad who had, I guess, he had one son that stood out from the pack, but he had all of his kids more or less boxed. So you got to talk about the fighting Fraziers. Because that's just a whole story in itself, man. You can actually have a podcast on Joe Frazier and his kids and what he kind of Joe Frazier's gym and how he molded it and everything else. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, dude, it's an entire story. I mean, rolling from Joe Frazier's story, whose family, immigrated from the South, to Philadelphia. That in itself is a fairly well-known story, for several books written about it and whatnot. But then also it's kind of like figures right into the fighting history of Philadelphia in the 60s and 70s, and I guess into the 80s too, a little bit, because of Joe Frazier's not only involvement as a pro, but his involvement in Philadelphia boxing and whatnot. And then, of course, how his, particularly Marvis Frazier's, path intersected with future heavyweight champion Mike Tyson. I mean, like, this is the entire thing, like, involves a whole lot of names here. You know what I mean? It's pretty crazy.
It is, so Joe had like you mentioned, Marvis. There was Joe Frazier Jr., who I think was Hector Frazier. And am I correct in I'm not even looking at anything. Rodney Frazier, I think, was another one.
I think so, yeah. Or I want to say Rodney was like a nephew, because he had a few.
I knew he did have like nephews and stuff fighting.
Yeah, too. Yeah. I believe Rodney was a nephew. But I'd have to look too. I'm not looking, but I know that he had some nephews.
Like Hector Frazier, I think, because I know it was either. I want to say Hector and Joe Frazier Jr. might have been the same. Like, I don't think Hector was his full name, but was his real name. But and then like Marvis. But so Frazier had his gym, like you mentioned. He opened his own gym in North Philadelphia in the 70s. And by the mid to late 70s, up in the early 80s, the place was booming. Like, there was very, packed. Lots of top fighters trained out of that gym. Or if they didn't train, they passed through for sparring or whatever it may be. But that was one of the mainstays of Philadelphia. Besides his kids training there, you had guys like James Schuler, who would pass through, who was a tremendous middleweight who died tragically young.
That was the first fighter, along with Marvis, that Joe signed under his management and gym. Yeah.
So you had James Schuler, you had a young Burt Cooper before he fell apart into drugs. The list goes on. I think, Saad Muhammad, I'm sure, passed through there, even though he wasn't a part of that gym. Like, I'm sure he worked out in there. The list goes on. The Spinks brothers, Michael Spinks, was definitely working out in there.
So I had to look just to make sure, and you were correct. Joe Frazier Jr., aka Hector Frazier.
Okay, I knew it. See, I just wanted to make sure I was right on that.
His sister, Jackie Frazier, lied, and then Rodney Frazier, which indeed was his nephew.
So those were the fighting Fraziers.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, I got them.
So between us, we'll get it. We'll
we always put everything. We put everything together. Yeah. Because I had a feeling
we are trustworthy after all.
Jr. was Hector Frazier. Yeah. So okay. And I believe he was the one, or one of them fought Vinny Paz and got knocked out. I want to say that was Joe Frazier Jr. But to go back, that was the thing. Joe had his gym in Philadelphia that he was training out of, and he had good trainers there too. George Benton was training out there, a legendary trainer, and others. Like, it was a very booming gym. Joe had a lot of business going through here, and as well as his career that he was still kind of trying to cling on to in the late 70s. And, things were good. But he was pushing his kids out there to be fighters, and they obviously took to it considering their backgrounds. So the one they want to talk about, the mainstay was Marvis, the one you just mentioned earlier. Marvis Frazier was a tremendous amateur. He came of the same era of the really doomed and ill-fated class of 1980, where all the members, for various reasons, fell into different situations, the plane crash, so on and so forth. But that was the era he was from. And early on, when it came to the heavyweight division, which I think, in the heavyweight division of amateur boxing, Frazier was the gold standard. And that's really saying something, considering how deep the U.S. amateur boxing scene was in the mid to late 70s up until the early 80s, because we're coming off of the 1976 Olympics. Ali was still heavyweight champion. Boxing's popularity as an all-time high. Everybody's fighting at that point. Everybody's turning to boxing. There was a lot of good fighters around that point. All right. And during that era, when Marvis Frazier was still an amateur, you had other guys who went on to become heavyweight champions or top contenders. You had Tony Tubbs, you had Greg Page, James Broad. The list goes on and on of different Tony Tucker was around that time. Like, even though I don't think he was a heavyweight, light heavyweight, like the list goes on and on of like all the top guys around there. And for Marvis Frazier back then to be the top amateur of his division and just the top dog and more or less the guy that was favored to become a favorite to represent the class of, for 1980 at the Olympics is saying something.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I think that we've talked about this before, but just to kind of like briefly go through the timeline between Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali, they obviously helped Muhammad Ali in particular, but Joe Frazier was obviously part of the equation, helped propel the popularity of boxing in the late 60s and early 70s. They helped propel it upward. And then the 1976 Olympics, and that team really reignited interest in boxing in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. And so Marvis Frazier was a part of that era of that kind of, writing that interest. There were a lot of things happening too. We did an entire show about Don King's US tournament, which fucked a whole bunch of shit up and, like really soured a lot of the perspective on it.
Don
but nonetheless,
King almost killed US boxing.
He damn near came pretty close. And it was almost as if he was trying to, but I mean, yeah, nonetheless, the sport persevered into the 80s, still kind of riding that wave. And that's where Marvis Frazier was. And you said he was a really good amateur, and stylistically too. This is something that a lot of people don't really mention, or maybe don't mention enough, is that Marvis Frazier as an amateur was a little bit different than the pro that we saw. And especially because his most famous fight, or his probably two most famous fights, number one is the absolute crushing loss to Mike Tyson in like 30 seconds or whatever it is. And number two is the ass kicking he took from Larry Holmes. And so, I mean, like, between those two, they're embarrassing enough and lasting enough, unfortunately, that's what he's mostly remembered for. As an amateur, he's, apparently, and from what you can see, even in reports, he fought way different. He was much more of a boxer and far more successful fighting that way. Exactly. That's who he learned from. And then he signed with his dad, along with James Schuler. And I mean, according to legend, and probably pretty much just according to what you can see with your own eyes, you can see Marvis Frazier trying to fight like Joe Frazier.
Because his dad made him to do it.
At the behest of his father. Yeah. So, I mean, it's another example of the kind of the toxicity in that offspring relationship in boxing that not always, but almost always comes along,
And that's a main one, because think of it like this, buddy, Pat. Frazier, like you just mentioned, was a classic boxer. And look how he was built, Marvis Frazier. He wasn't built like his dad. Joe Frazier was a short heavyweight, but it was built like a redwood tree, stocky, thick legs, hips, the whole barrel chested, short arms, but just thick. Like, he was built for his style. He was never going to be a fancy boxer. Marvis Frazier was nothing like that. He was tall, he was lean, he had long arms. He was built to be a stylist. He was built to be a boxer, not a come in there, seek and destroy slugger, peekaboo style like Joe Frazier, bobbing and weaving like that. That's the complete opposite of anything he should have done. And to completely take what he had learned from George Benton, who was one of the greatest trainers of all time, and Benton molded him into his own little project. He made him into a heavyweight version of himself, like, cruiserweight, heavyweight version of himself. And Frazier, by all accounts, it's interesting that a lot of his amateur fights are actually kind of hard to find, it seems, considering how much is out there and how often they were televised. I'm sure he was televised very often, but everything I've seen on YouTube when they show, different amateur tournaments, I haven't seen any of his footage yet. But that as an aside, like you said, when you read everything that you've seen about him and all that, he was a classic stylist who was a beautiful boxer and was the top of his class. Almost on that plane crash, went to went to where was it? Excuse me, Poland.
Poland, yeah.
He almost went to Poland on that plane, on the ill-fated plane crash that took out the U.S. team in 1980. But Joe Frazier had a premonition the night before, he said, or earlier that week, saying that he knew something bad was going to happen and wouldn't let Marvis go, so he avoided that. But like you said, once Joe started getting more involved with his career, as Marvis started getting more prominence, and he was about to turn pro, that's when he took over his career. And another thing that like hindered Marvis also was that he suffered an injury in his last amateur fight before he turned pro. The aforementioned James Broad, who I mentioned, was a part of like the deep class of that era.
Broadax.
Yes, a giant of a heavyweight, by the way. He got a lot bigger, and I mean, another tragic figure, but a very talented fighter in his own right when he was in his prime before his vices took over. And he actually knocked Frazier out in the first round when they fought as amateurs. And when he did it, I think he pinched Marvis Frazier's nerves or something like that too. Like he gave him some kind of spinal injury that kind of like, it was a bad knockout. Like, he stumped him pretty good. And when he did that, Marvis turned pro, but he already had an injury that they felt they needed to accelerate him a little bit. Kind of like what they did with David Reed because of his eye. But what made it so bad was because Frazier completely took away everything that he had done before that. Like all the boxing, everything, stripped that away, and then he looked like a clone of himself. And when people would question Frazier and ask him certain things or, interview him about it, he would always make the comments, oh, you can do the boxing stuff, but when it comes to the pros, you got to sit down and settle on your punches, really dig in there, blah, blah, blah. Basically saying that he doesn't want him to look like George Benton. He wants him to look like himself. And for a while, the charade worked, I guess, even though he wasn't that impressive in his performances up to that point, because you can just tell he's fighting heavyweights that are a lot bigger than him, and he's fighting a clone of it, like a clone like his dad, and he's a lot smaller waist. He's not big like that. He's not strong enough to be able to pull something like that, and he's getting away with these wins because he's athletic and he's young and he's talented enough. But at the same time, he's like,
And that's another thing, dude, is that I don't know Marvis Frazier, and I don't know his fucking anatomy or anything like that. But I also question whether or not he necessarily needed to be a heavyweight, or whether or not he was pushed. He was
clearly smaller than everybody he fought mostly.
Yeah, he seemed like he could have like gone down to light heavyweight or something like that, and that he was probably pushed to heavyweight because his dad was a heavyweight champion, would be my guess. But I don't even know that Marvis Frazier would out and out say that. I honestly don't know. So
he got pushed to Larry Holmes instead.
Yeah, dude, just yeah, man. Larry Holmes just gave him the old, just clowned him. It was bad.
And that was Frazier's fault too, because if you watch it, he tries clowning Holmes, which is a colossally stupid move. But he made it was almost like, when Mike Quarry was fighting Bob Foster, and he made Foster miss with like 2 or 3 punches, so he decided to Ali shuffle him and start acting stupid. And that's when Foster, hit him with a left hook and almost killed him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Frazier made Holmes miss with a couple of punches, started feeling himself, started doing the whole dump, sticking his chin out. Holmes is just sitting there like, this kid's going to die, which he did. So he measures him, hits him with the right hand. Holmes goes skinning across the ring.
Yeah. Yeah, like immediately, like, oh, what did I do?
And then Holmes gets up, and as he's yelling at, I think it was Mills Lane, I think was the ref. Every time he hit him with the right hand, stop the fight. Okay.
Yeah. Just doing the old measure with the left, like,
bang, him like he's a child. Almost like what a parent would take the belt. You know how it is, Pat, when you got hit with a belt as a kid? It's literally what it is. He's measuring him and just.
Yeah, it was brutal, dude. Like, just not even so much damaging as it is embarrassing, which is exactly like as it gets stopped. Marvis is just like, Joe comes over. Marvis is just like, holy shit, like bewildered more and embarrassed than hurt. It looks like, but brutal, dude. Yeah, that's I think a really good example for a whole number of reasons. And
one more thing to say to mention this, it should be mentioned that like we said, Frazier had a very busy gym. He had a lot of guys and all that. Isn't it interesting that he never developed a world champion? The closest he had was like an NABF champion with Bert Cooper. And was he still with Schuler by the time Schuler fought Hearns, or did Schuler move on by that point? I'm not even sure. But
I think Schuler was still with him, but I'm not positive.
And I think he was actually involved with with Von Bean, that heavyweight from the 90s too. But I mean, anyways, like his own kids, Marvis never really, besides having a few high profile fights, never amounted to, to the potential he had in his other kids and nephews and such.
Same. I mean, it doesn't really shock me. A number of these examples are going to be a parent who went on to also be a trainer, or a parent who was a trainer or something like that. And that doesn't really shock me because, especially with Joe Frazier, he seemed like a pretty stubborn guy. Yeah, and totally. if he was the kind of trainer that really tried to only teach one style, which some trainers do, some trainers aren't like that and are more of the, well, I'll take what you got and we'll work with it type of, style. And others are, no, I'm going to teach a cross arm defense. I'm going to teach you, or whatever it is, like Customato tended to teach that very similar style, to all of his fighters, etc. And if Joe Frazier was that way, that wouldn't surprise me whatsoever, because that is not the kind of style that's very successful overall for most fighters. Like for most fighters, you're better off learning how to throw punches in a very orthodox textbook manner, defensively sound, etc. Like you're far more likely to be successful doing that than you are boring in, overwhelming somebody and, moving your head like inside, but also kind of acknowledging that you're going to be taking a lot of punches due to your style. That's not the kind of thing a lot of fighters can do. It takes balls, it takes fucking durability and endurance, and it takes power, because you can't do that shit with no power. So, I mean, that doesn't really surprise me that much, that he had fighters that went pretty far, but just not to a world championship.
Yeah, it's a very complex case. There's a very good book out on Frazier, his biography. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head at the moment, but it goes into pretty good detail. You know which one I'm talking about? The recent one that came out in the past couple of years.
The Mark Cram Jr. one?
Yeah, that's it. Mark Cram Jr. Yes.
Yeah.
But he goes into pretty good detail talking about Frazier and how he managed his children and other fighters from that era and what was going on. So it's worth checking out.
Yeah, Mark Cram was a fantastic writer for Sports Illustrated and wrote a couple other places, but primarily Sports Illustrated. Really, really good writer. One of my favorite to read. Mark Cram Jr. was a good book. Yeah, I would recommend it for anybody looking to kind of learn more about Frazier for sure. But
what else you got, my friend?
All right, I got a pretty good one that I wanted to talk about, just because I guess I read a lot about it. And so got how that works. Gotta go to.
You gotta go talk about what you read. Yeah.
Yeah, but so back in the day, right? Back in the 1940s, there was a lightweight named Lenny Mancini. Lenny Boom Boom Mancini. Obviously, you know where this is going. There's no other way where it's going, right? But, Lenny Mancini was a very good fighter, a guy who didn't have a ton of power, but was a guy who was a very popular fighter because he was a good TV type of fighter, a fighter that was very entertaining, a fighter that threw a lot of punches and wanted to make the fight. And in any case, he wound up losing a split decision to Sammy Angot in a non-title fight. And then, won, I think, a couple more fights, and then was going to get a title shot against Sammy Angot. And literally, like, I think it was either a week or 2 weeks, I can't remember what he said, that he wound up being drafted, for World War II, and that he had asked the draft board for an extension. He said, can I at least get a week or two extension or something like that, so that I can do this fight? I'll even donate all of my purse to an army fund or something like that. And they said, no, we don't want the money, we want you. And so he wound up getting sent off to World War II. And in any case, during that time, he got injured really badly by a mortar shell. And then that injury wound up not taking him out of boxing entirely, but he just wasn't the same after that. But he was trained by Ray Arcel, actually. So he was a world ranked, fighter. He wasn't just some bum or something like that. But he had an entire backstory, and that kind of made for good news fodder when Ray Mancini came along. And Ray Mancini, of course, as an amateur, I guess he was discouraged from fighting by his dad. His dad didn't really want him to fight, but that, he said, well, I guess if you choose it, you're going to do it. And so Ray Mancini went on to fight, and became an extremely exciting fighter himself. And that dynamic, that father-son dynamic between them, again, that's, I guess, like I said, Mark Kriegel's wet dream of the show. He wrote a book about this.
He wrote a book about Mancini.
Yeah, this exact topic. But
it was a good book too.
Yeah, no, it is, and does break down and kind of touch on a lot of the inner workings of that father-son relationship, because they did have kind of I don't want to say a weird relationship, but just kind of a complex relationship from an emotional standpoint. And I mean, it's something that I think is really interesting for a whole number of reasons, because you could see that, like, from the time he's like super young, Ray Mancini is basically devoted to his father. Like,
so hold up, what was when I believe the backstory was, correct me if I'm wrong, how he discovered that his dad was a fighter? Was it that he found books on it, or he what was that he discovered? How did he discover
no that? His dad had a big photo. His parents, his family had a big photo, like a 2 foot tall photo,
okay,
of his dad, posing,
yeah.
Back when he was a contender. And it was like framed or something in their living room. And so from the time he was really little, they would say, like, Ray Mancini said that other kids wanted to be other things like firefighter or whatever, and that he always wanted to be a boxer. And he always told people he wanted to be a boxer, but that his dad kind of discouraged him, and that he had said, that I don't want you to be a boxer because it's hard, it's rough, it's cold, like it's not a nice world, and you don't want to go into that world. But then eventually, and actually, during his kind of sports playing years, Ray Mancini, I guess, was really good at baseball. And, he played basketball, baseball, football, never really did boxing. But then when he was in his later teenage years, figured, I want to box, because his older brother was Lenny Jr.,
Yes.
who was actually a really good amateur. And he used to go to the gym with his older brother, Lenny Jr. And I guess one day he had said to the trainer, I'm going to be, I guess something like Lenny Jr. wasn't doing something right, or wasn't doing something the way the trainer wanted, or something like that. And Ray said to the trainer, I'm going to be the best fighter you guys ever seen. And of course, this is another kind of backdrop of this is Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown, Ohio was I believe a mining town, if I'm not mistaken, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure, in any case, it was an industrial town. And the town lost just an absolute shitload of jobs in the 1970s, which like crippled the town economically. And
Youngstown was definitely a working class. If they're going to describe that for America, that's
well, and it's along what is described as the Rust Belt, which is a bunch of industrial towns that have basically just gone to shit, or at one point went to shit because whatever industry that propped them up shut down, or went bad, or sour, or whatever, coal mining and stuff like that. Well, there's no more coal to mine, or that's not the energy, blah blah blah. So point being, that's another backdrop here, is that this is an extremely working class town, where that's one of the ethics, that work ethic, or that kind of like hardworking, slumming it type of thing is important to the story here. So anyway,
not to cut, but also too, I do remember something I remember from the book. Ray Mancini wrote a poem about his dad.
Well, and what I was what I was going to say earlier was that, like, Ray Mancini's devotion to his father was like bordering on obsession.
That's
like,
what I, yeah, yep.
Because I mean, at some point when he got into boxing, he put his picture in the corner of Lenny Mancini's picture in the living room, and like, you know, snuck it into the corner or whatever. Anyway, yeah, he used to write poetry and he used to talk to interviewers and stuff like that. Why are you fighting? What are you doing? It's all for my dad. I want to win a championship for my dad because my dad, blah, 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 because my dad, this, my dad's had a really tough life. He deserves this, you know, stuff like that. And, you know, there were even times when it seemed like his dad was like, you know, he's got to fight for himself, you know, he's got to stop. But he never stopped. He still talks about his dad, you know, so
When I met him, oh yeah, absolutely. He's very devoted, man. Very nice guy too.
Yeah, and nothing wrong. He seems like a really good guy. Nothing wrong with being devoted to your parents or whatever. But I'm just saying that
Totally.
the motivations between, you know, behind him getting into the ring, and also like the style that he fought in too. It's crazy because, you know, I'll shut the fuck up in a second and let you jump in here. But a really prominent piece in so first of all, Lenny Jr. actually wound up dying on Valentine's Day 1981 from a shooting that was deemed accidental when supposedly he was showing his girlfriend at the time how to shoot a gun, and his girlfriend shot him and killed him. So that was another kind of heartache and hardship that the Mancini family wound up having to go through. But then in 1982, the following year, that was when Ray Mancini versus Kim Duk-gu happened. And so obviously, or Duk-gu Kim, as most people, I guess, would remember it. And point being, Kim wound up passing away from injuries sustained in the fight. And the narrative since then has been like, well, Ray Mancini, he was afraid after that. He lost his killer instinct. And I think that's the kind of common thing that people say when a fighter accidentally kills another fighter in the ring. And this is yet another example where that wasn't actually the case whatsoever. And that's a nice kind of poetic way to say it, but it's not the case, because Ray Mancini was actually hounded before that in the late 70s and the early 80s about lacking killer instinct, if you can believe it, because there were a few outings that he had where people were like, wow, he's not closing the show real well. I mean, again, Ray Mancini is an incredible TV fighter who was like nonstop action for the most part. So that's pretty crazy that it was even getting criticized in that way.
Yeah,
but anyway, yeah. So anyway, I figured that was a really good example because I did a lot of reading on them, as you can probably tell.
I mean, it's a great one, man. Mancini was one of the biggest stars of the 80s in boxing. He was a matinee idol. He was a good-looking guy. Like you mentioned, his backstory with his dad, America ate that up. And when he was coming up in the ranks, he was featured prominently on television. By the time he challenged Alexis Arguello, the great Alexis Arguello, for the lightweight championship in 1981, that was like a made-for-TV movie right there, right? You know, we already know Mancini's backstory, his devotion to his dad. He wants to win the lightweight championship for his father. Now it's his chance. Like, he's undefeated. He's gonna fight for the lightweight championship. Alexis Arguello is a great fighter. A great fighter. And not only that, he's just a great human being, humble, and just a genuine, really good person. And they produced an incredible fight. You know, I mean, everybody that listens to the show obviously has probably watched it, but if you've never seen it, please go back and watch it, man, because Mancini put on the fight of his life. He really did. Like, he went in there and he tried, and he had a lot of success early on. Arguello didn't come through that unscathed. It was a battle. But Arguello, being the great champion that he is, eventually, you know, as other champions usually do, saw his way through, started breaking through slowly but surely. And Mancini started breaking down himself. And by the time the 14th round hit, and Arguello finally finished him, you know, that was the exclamation point. But it was a great fight. And it was the ending too. After the ending, what was the post-fight interview? Mancini's sitting, you know, standing there with his dad, and he's kind of, you know, being consoled or whatever. And Arguello comes over with these beautiful words. He was like, you know, I love your father. I love your father. Like, I love my father. Anything I can do, you know, I'd love to help you, yada, yada, yada. And I'm sure people were crying at home. Well, at least the wives or the husbands that were watching and drinking their Pabst Blue Ribbon and smoking some cigarettes. And like, it was
this is fucking beautiful.
Yeah.
This is fucking beautiful.
And so, like, it was an incredible moment. And like, that was the beauty of 80s boxing back then, that you can catch shit like that, you know. And when Mancini was finally able to win the title the following year against Toro Frias, and a very, very good fight too, man. That was an incredible one-round blowout. Not a blowout, one-round war where Mancini was hurt early on. He was cut, he was getting beat up, and then he came back and blasted Frias in the same round. Like, you just had yourself a made gold for television fighter that was going to get star ratings no matter who we fought.
Yeah, dude. And actually, Arguello's victory over Ray Mancini, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's like his crowning achievement or anything like that, but it was an incredible fight. And that was probably one of the underrated things about Alexis Arguello. Is we could obviously talk about Ray Mancini as a great TV fighter, but Alexis Arguello was probably underrated in that department too. Because I mean, there were a number of fights where he was getting beaten up early, knocked down early, hurt early, whatever, and he wound up having to come back or take some shots in order to. He was an incredible technician, but he was also a really good TV fighter and one of those fighters that overcame adversity more than once.
Very much so. But I would say that him showing the compassion that he did after that fight really propelled him popularity wise too, because as often as these guys were featured on television, Arguello was featured too, but like this was like a very high profile fight that more people were probably tuning into as opposed to his other, title defenses back in the day. So for America, a lot of people were seeing him for the first time. And when they see like, oh my God, this guy's the most perfect human, whatever, it definitely gained a lot of popularity and notoriety for him because everybody always described him as like the gentleman of the prize ring. You know what I mean? The noble fighter and all that. And that really personified. That was him. How he was acting, there was nothing fake about how he was, showing his gratitude and showing how much he loved, how much love he was showing to Mancini and his dad.
That's what everybody always says about meeting him is that he would take the time to speak with like everybody.
Yeah. So like, all right, not to veer off too quick, but like my dad, for instance, him being a photographer, he covered the Civil War. He covered the revolution in Nicaragua during the 80s between the Sandinistas and the Contras. And he has some crazy stories from that shit. Like I was, I don't know, probably 2.5, 3 years old. So I don't remember any of it, but my mom definitely did. And she was freaked out because she didn't think my dad was going to come back from it. But anyways, he obviously survived, yada, yada, yada. He met Arguello because he loved Arguello and he got to talk to him about it and stuff like that. And Arguello was like really, really intrigued by it and sat down with him and was like really, and showed his compassion and told him like appreciative. It was like, oh, thank you so much for doing that and all this stuff and bringing supplies and like, you really appreciate it. He touched my dad doing that. It was cool.
Well, and just to kind of like explain that just a tiny bit, Alexis Arguello got very much involved in the local politics of Managua, Nicaragua. So that's why he figures into that, his country's revolution so prominently.
Mm-hmm. So that was it.
So what's another kind of offspring duo? Let's not talk about the band because I hate them.
I couldn't even tell you one song, bro. Well, this one's more modern as well, but again, there's a lot of story to this and a lot of backstory. But I wanted to bring up Corey Spinks because I mean the story is there with him and his dad and stuff like that, but I'm not sure if anybody knows the whole story about his whole family between his other siblings too, including one that passed away at an early age. So yeah, Corey Spinks.
Yeah, there's obviously the three of them. Yes. Well, would you say that they're probably the most accomplished boxing family?
The Spinks?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. If you put them all together, absolutely. Yeah. You've got Michael Spinks, who's in the Hall of Fame, undisputed light heavyweight champion.
Yeah, two Olympic gold medalists.
2 Olympic gold medalists from the 76 team. Leon Spinks beat Muhammad Ali for the heavyweight title. Regardless of how the rest of his career went on, he still beat Ali for the championship.
Yeah, he's an Olympic gold medalist who beat Muhammad Ali like in what was his like eighth fight? Yeah.
And then you have Corey Spinks, who became undisputed welterweight champion.
Right.
Like undisputed. Moved up, became junior middleweight champion, arguably beat Jermaine Taylor. So yeah, I would say definitely they're the most accomplished family. And considering their background and where they came from, that's fucking awesome.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, because there's like some other families who have two members who are really accomplished, but none of them, I don't think, have like 3 like that.
Especially like an offspring too, really coming up like that, But
yeah, that's pretty wild.
Corey Spinks.
The Shade Brothers, though. I'm just kidding.
Jesus Christ. That's a story for another time, right, bro?
Yeah.
But well, with Corey Spinks, um, he was a guy that came up really tough, really, really tough. He, as much as I love Leon Spinks, you do, he seems like a lovable dude. He wasn't really there in their kids'
Yeah, he
lives.
was not a very good dad,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
not at all. Leon had a lot of things going on in the '80s and stuff. Well, after he became heavyweight champion, Leon just kind of went on a whirlwind that you know took him throughout his entire career. I don't know if he ever really stopped until after he was retired and finally was able to settle down a little bit when, he had a lot of issues and other difficulties. But Leon always had a good heart. You can't take that wrong. But to say he was a good dad early on would definitely not be the case because he wasn't there for his kids, early on.
Well,
And
yeah, Michael and Leon grew up in the what was it, the Pruitt-Igoe, I want to
yes,
say,
yeah,
St. Louis, which is a
a
housing project, which is
notoriously bad project.
yeah, which St.
And
Louis itself is underrated in the
yes.
holy shit cities, on the holy shit list. So I
So
mean,
with Leon growing up, Michael and Leon, they're brothers, but like Michael's a little bit younger, and I believe their sister too. Like Leon was the oldest sibling, and he had to be the one that had to take the brunt of the beatings because of that. The other ones are too young; they weren't going out. So Leon got beat up, he got picked on, other stuff. But also, he knew he had to fight, and when he became a boxer and he went back to the neighborhood, he started beating everyone else's ass, and then people left him alone. And then he realized he was good at it. Michael soon joined him, who was a lot more meeker and quieter, but you follow in your brother's footsteps and you have to learn how to defend yourself. So before you know it, the Spinks brothers are on a rampage. They're one of the top, both of them are top amateurs in the country. When we mentioned you're fighting hundreds and hundreds of amateur fights back then, bro. You're fighting every week, every weekend. The U.S. amateur system was wild back then. And these guys were the top of their class, both of them. They both ended up becoming Olympic gold medalists and move on. So of course, Spinks being the wild dude that is, he has kids. He has different, and they grew up without their dad. They grew up real, struggling. If you look at the accounts and different stories that are written, all of them would say the same thing. They grew up in poverty. They grew up in the projects. They were like, yeah, my dad was heavyweight champion, but what we have to show for it? Leon would see them time to time and, visit them, whatever, or they would go visit him, but, it was never like an extended visit, or if it was, nothing really ended really well. But so Corey came up really, really tough. He did. And he has a couple of older brothers. One of them had promise as well as a boxer in the late 80s, early 90s. And that was Leon Spinks Jr., also aka Leon Calvin, if you want to take the mother's last name. And he was a very promising boxer back in the early day. God, who was it that wrote that? I first read about him from the article. Berger on boxing, Phil Berger. You know that the
mm-hmm.
punchlines. So he wrote an article all about Leon Calvin and his whole life growing up, being Leon Spinks' son, not seeing his dad, trying to, navigate the ways of a pro, but except living in St. Louis in the hood and, being a young guy and all that. It was crazy. But long story short, Leon Calvin was a very promising boxer in the late 80s, early 90s. Leon Spinks' oldest child, and turned pro, was 2-0, but he still was involved in a nightlife and subsequently got murdered. And some street issue or whatever it was. And so that was the start of it. His other two kids, I want to say Daryl Spinks was a light heavyweight or so. Mm-hmm. And then Corey Spinks, went on to become pros. Daryl, I think he fought for a regional title here and there. I actually remember, I think, watching him on, I don't know, I want to say Fox Sports or something at one point, but he didn't really pan out too much. Corey was the one that had the most potential. And the thing with Corey, though, was that he didn't have much of a punch. He was a slickster. He was a good amateur. He had a good amateur background, but you really didn't know how far he could become as a pro because, like I said, his punch was non-existent, but he was a really, really slick boxer. And also, even though Leon had such a diminished name at that point, still being the son of a former heavyweight champion carried some kind of weight, right? So I remember in the early 2000s, he was gaining a little bit of prominence. What do you think?
Yeah. And there's actually, he just fought last year. There's Leon Spinks the third too.
Oh, that's right. That's Daryl. That's Leon Calvin's kid, right?
Who just fought. Yeah, he fought like last year too. Unfortunately, his record's not super good, but just in any case,
But
he's
that Leon Spinks Jr., the one that got murdered, that's his kid.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I mean, like, yeah, I do remember there was another Spinks coming up around that time, but like, I don't remember paying super close attention. Obviously, I remember paying close attention to Corey.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I would say the first time I ever really, I mean, I knew of him, and I remember seeing his name, but I hadn't really seen much of him until the Michele Picarillo fight,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
first one, because there was such a stink made about how bad a decision it was, bro. We were just talking about how these Italian fighters be fucking getting,
Well, you
out of.
know, all in the late. It was so interesting because in the in the 90s and the early 2000s, you'd hear all about these god awful bullshit decisions that were happening in Germany and other parts of Europe where Americans were getting absolutely screwed. But we had no access to watch it back then, unless you were tape trading or something, you know?
Right, yeah.
So you have to go by the accounts of Brian Dugan from Ring Magazine and other correspondents from back then.
Yeah, so you'd be like, damn, I guess Sven Otke is shitty, but I wouldn't know. But I guess
Yeah.
I guess he sucks. I don't
And
know.
then, 5, 6 years later, when YouTube came around, wow, he really was shitty.
Yeah, yeah. You're like, fuck, I'm not voting for that guy. Nah,
Yeah,
fuck
yeah, yeah.
that. Yeah, that was kind of like similarly, but I remember hearing about that fight and then reading about it and then finally seeing it eventually. But that was one of the first times I was like, oh, okay, obviously he's rising to more prominence than I realized. And then obviously in the early 2000s he really broke out. But yeah, I don't really remember personally the other Spinks kids, but yeah, obviously a big
Yeah, that
boxing
was
family.
the Leon Calvin. What makes it sad, he was a promising pro. He actually signed a contract with Cedric back in like,
Oh, I did. Yeah, obviously I didn't know
yeah.
that.
So he had signed a contract with Cedric Kushner back in like 1990, and Cedric was a top player back then. So that was to potentially show. But like I said, he was unfortunately murdered. Corey, um, no one really was sure how far. Like he ended up beating Piccolo, whatever, in a rematch for the IBF title. But when he did fight Ricardo Mayorga, I remember the consensus was that was kind of like the coronation for Mayorga, right? He had already beaten Vernon Forrest twice, who is basically considered the best fighter in the division, if not one of the best in the world. And then for him to beat him twice, like Corey Spinks, was almost like an afterthought. And that was on one of those massive Don King pay-per-views that was distributed by HBO.
Yep. There was like I can't remember who else was on it, but I want to say Hopkins was on it. I
Ruiz
don't.
Rockman, I think, might have been on.
Yeah. Yep. That was that same one. Yeah. Oh man, dude, that fight was so bad. Like, I mean, I never really liked Ricardo Mayorga. Like now I appreciate his personality and what he brought, like in terms of excitement, but I just never really liked him. I kind of thought that he was just a dick. Like he just kind of, I mean, there's a difference between good trash talk and just being a fucking asshole and like trying to rile up your opponent by like being like mean spirited and malicious.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's what he came off as. But regardless, point is, it was like I didn't want to root for him or anything like that. And I felt like in the spots where Corey Spinks was actually putting it together, like he obviously had more skill and was doing okay. But then it was like anytime Mayorga even like touched him, he was like flailing to the canvas. And I just remember being like, all right, dude, now we're starting to get into territory where like I don't care who wins. Like I just want this to be over with. And I don't think I've rewatched it since. I remember watching it at the time being like, this is so bad.
I saw it. When was that? 03?
Roughly something like that.
I think like it was in the winter time, so I'm gonna say
It
03.
was bad.
But yeah, I have not watched it since that fight. But stinks Spinks.
Ugh, that's what they used to call him at the time.
Spinks did score an upset, and no one, from what I remember, no one really expected that to happen. That was a pretty significant upset that Spinks did. Like it was an exciting fight, like you said, man. Considering that one and Rockman Ruiz and others were on that card, that was kind of dismal. But it was still fascinating to see that Mayorga was frustrated as hell, couldn't do anything about it, and Spinks won a rightful decision. And it felt right too, because Mayorga, I think, before the fight said that he was going to send Spinks with his dead mother who had recently passed away, or something really, really like.
Yeah, that's what that kind of stuff is what I mean. Is like that's the kind of like mean spirited like
That was
trash talk
really
that's
awful.
not.
So for Spinks to kind of slap him around instead was like pretty cool to see.
Yeah.
And again, like for a guy who had little to no power, like he did, and he didn't have a fan friendly style that would really equate to like being popular with judges. He had a very successful career against a lot of top level guys, man. He wasn't easy to fight, and he had very sublime skills, and he beat some good guys on along the way too. So
yeah, and pound for pound, his ring walks were like absolutely.
Oh man, they were awesome, bro. You can't like him dancing. For instance, I watched the Judah fight. Well, at least the beginning of the first Judah fight, which wasn't a bad fight. And
that was actually pretty entertaining fight, in my opinion.
Yeah,
I remember that.
It was. And I think he came out to everybody in the room get tipsy. I forgot who it was. That Jay Quan, I think that was the person who rapped that. But Spinks, yo, he was moving, bro. Like I was almost like rewatching. I'm like, how was he not tired getting to the ring? Because he put on a full-on dance routine into there. And then for the rematch, when he came out with Nelly, the same thing when in St. Louis.
Yep.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, that was the fateful that started the whole don't get wrapped to the ring because that shit is a curse.
Yeah.
But I mean, yes, like he was definitely, even now, like I remember a couple years back, he was on some social media doing some goofball ass dancing. He seems like a good character too. But
and for me, like I'm partial to the Spinks family. I love Leon from my experiences with him. But when I used to work for Cedric, I probably told this story before on the podcast, but when he would put on the show called The Fight to Educate, which was like a charity event in New Hampshire, when he put on fighters, whatever, he promoted the whole event. He always would bring in like celebrities to schmooze with the people sitting at the tables and all that. And that year he couldn't afford some of the celebrities not that he could afford. The people he was trying to get, like Larry Holmes and Evander Holyfield, were just throwing out stupid ass prices for them, for their services. What? So we're like, fuck that. I told Ced, I was like, honestly, if you want to more bang for your buck, and I was like, these people won't know the difference either way. I was like, get the Spinks family. And and Cedric's accent, I saw him, he thought about it, he stroked his chin, he goes, that's a great idea. And he was like, call Butch Lewis. And I was like, really? So I tried to call Butch and got him on the phone with Cedric, and that was cool because like Butch hadn't been in boxing for a few years at that point, even though he was still kind of managing a fighter named Farouk Salim. And Butch told him, he was like, you want the Spinks family, put Salim on the card, who hadn't fought in a couple of years. He was like, you got a deal. And Cedric was like, yeah, fuck it, I don't care, sure.
So Butch Lewis reached into his sleeveless tux and grabbed his cell phone.
Yeah. But you know what? I'm proud to say I was the last person that got that did business with Butch Lewis in boxing. And I got to be at the press conference.
Speaking of characters,
I got to be at the press conference when he it was a press conference. I say that in quotations, but it was like a cool thing. There was a lot of people there from New Hampshire trying to be curious, and Butch Lewis went on full show, and that was awesome to see. Like he was there bragging like it was 1986 again, going up and down, yelling, talking. And then he was like, yeah, man, let me introduce now the Spinks family, my brothers. And like, it was cool as shit. I'm not even going to lie. That was pretty awesome. And each one of them made a speech. Like Michael made a speech, Leon made a speech, Corey made a speech. I got to hang out with all of them all weekend. I got to go to dinner with Butch and Cedric and a couple of others and just listen to them share stories all night. Like that was a beautiful time, man. For a fight freak like me who's obsessed with the 80s and other times, to sit with that type of people and to hang out with Butch Lewis, that was cool.
Definitely on the level of those kind of like wrestling hype men, wrestling promoter, wrestling manager type
and
of.
And I got to witness that, man. Like he was a total into that. Even if you watched him on those HBO documentaries when they talk about Ali and Frazier, because Butch Lewis was close to Frazier, and you hear him, he's like, he hits him with a left hook, yow! Like, he gets all animated, man. Butch Lewis was a character.
Yeah, dude, that's for sure. The whole Spinks brothers story is it's a pretty entertaining story. There's a lot of good elements to it, and I mean, it's really unfortunate that Leon had to pass away somewhat recently.
Rest in peace, Leon. Man.
Yeah, man, rest in peace for sure. But he was somebody who made a lot of people happy. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
That's for sure. So I wanted to talk about another family that I figured you probably would not have brought up and that I hinted at on social media the other day. But, and also because I want to branch out. I want to not just talk about American or like, British families or whatever. I wanted to do a little bit more too. For instance, I wanted to talk about the Penalosas. Basically, dude, the Penalosas in the Philippines they're like boxing royalty. And I mean, and they should be. And here's why, right? So Carl Penalosa, he was a two-time junior welterweight champion in the Philippines, a Filipino champion, not a world champion, in the 1960s. And the best fighters he fought were Stan Harrington and Takeshi Paul Fuji, of course, a very heavy punching fighter who shortly thereafter won the junior welterweight championship.
Vicious.
Dude was a murderous puncher. There's a handful of his fights on YouTube. You can go see. He had for instance, there's one of the knockouts that he scored was against, gosh, now I'm drawing a blank, but he scored an absolutely fucking brutal knockout that was like
the title.
That knockout of the year level, like just fucking. Why am I drawing a blank? Help me, Aris.
I'm drawing a blank too right now, my friend.
Oh man. Well, in any case, he was a really hard punching fighter, and so it's not surprising that Carl Penalosa actually lost to him in 2 rounds by knockout. Nothing wrong with that. He's like on a pound for pound level. Paul Fuji's probably a lot higher than most people realize, despite the fact that he's not very well known, and a lot of that
because he's a footnote, bro. Everybody knows that if they know him, they know he's the dude that lost to Loche, and like Loche just put a masterclass on against him type deal.
Right, and I mean, I guess he was considered somewhat crude to some people, but he was just a heavy punching guy, and there's no shame to losing to Paul Fuji or anything like that, but because of the lower weights and stuff like that, a lot of those guys are often dismissed. But point is, Carl Penalosa was the father of Jerry Penalosa, Jonathan Penalosa, and Dodie Boy Penalosa. So most people these days are probably going to know Jerry Penalosa from like the latter day version from a handful of years ago, where he very unfortunately took out one of my favorite fighters, Johnny Gonzalez. That
with
day
a
was
freak body shot, bro.
That day was my 9/11, dude. Day was my Trojan War. So, but Jerry, first of all, Jerry Penalosa. Jerry is short for Geronimo, so that's pretty fucking cool. So, I mean, Jerry Penalosa was actually extremely popular in the Philippines in the 1990s. He held a world title at junior bantamweight, and then he took Johnny Gonzalez's title at bantamweight nearly 10 years later. So obviously Jerry Penalosa, I mean, he was a popular fighter because he had a good punch and he came to fight and he could take a punch too. So he made for entertaining TV and he went fairly far.
Dude, I saw him on Tuesday Night Fights one time, which was like really random. You remember that?
I don't. I'm trying to think of what fight that would have been.
He fought a guy, a fringe contender who died years ago by the name of Apollo Sacido. Epilopito Polo Salcido. But I remember I watched it on Tuesday Night Fights, and I had just read about Penalosa in Ring Magazine after becoming champion by beating a very good fighter by name Hiroshi Kawashima. And I was a kid back then. We're talking, I was 12 at this point, so it's not like I knew what was going on. I put on, as the summertime or something like that, and I put on Tuesday Night Fights, and there's Jerry Penalosa, who I just read about, and I know he's from the Philippines, a country that's not usually featured in America. I'm like, the fuck is he doing fighting? Where was the fight at? At Foxwoods. So,
damn, dude, man, they used to put on some shit at Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun, bro.
Like, I mean, yeah, if there was but that was the time, and bro, I'm not gonna lie, he put on a clinic because I had seen Salcido before fight Marco Antonio Barrera's brother, and he got robbed on that. And then I read that he fought Danny Romero and gave him a hell of a fight. So I was familiar with him, but Penalosa put on a clinic, man, just shut him down. And I was like, wow, he was really impressive. Like, he really caught my eye. And then I didn't see him again for years because he just went back to fighting contenders back in in Asia and such and other places, stuff like that. But yeah, dude, Penalosa has always just been like a technician, just one of those guys, just very, very underrated because of the lower weight divisions. But even if he's never been like one of the best fighters in the world, he's always just been a solid pro through and through.
Yeah, and his brother, Dodi Boy Penalosa, a
Mm-hmm.
2 division champion in the 1980s himself, pretty popular, good fighter, also I should say a fairly underrated couple of division in the 80s,
Oh, very
flyweight
much
and
so.
junior flyweight. Those were really underrated divisions. And I mean, underrated for obvious reasons because there's a shitload of non-American fighters littering the divisions at these times, especially a ton of Korean fighters. And I
Yes.
mean, dude, the Koreans never fucking get love from the American fight fans. It's a tragic fact, unfortunately. But
Don't
these
ruin anyone. Hall of Fame. Hello.
dude, I know. I get sick of seeing the name there. I'm like, bro, you guys suck. But in any case, also John Penalosa, the other Carl Penalosa's other kid, also a very good fighter, but unfortunately he was knocked out quite badly by Kim Yong Gang when he challenged for the WBA flyweight title in 1992, and he just kind of like never recovered from there. After that, he had 3 straight losses, and that was it for him, unfortunately. But Dodi Boy's sons, Dodi Boy Jr. and Dave Penalosa, were also, so Carl Penalosa's grandkids. What they were professionals, and they were doing pretty well. Dodi Boy Jr. was unbeaten at like I think 19-0. Dave was something like 19-1, but they both seem to have just stopped fighting for whatever reason. So in any case, like I said, opening up, dude, the Penalosa family is royalty in the Philippines, and this is
Absolutely,
why.
man. That was a good call because I wouldn't have brought that up.
Yeah, dude, I just came upon it like on by accident and was like, you know what, I should bring them up, dude, because I don't know enough about them. So let's learn.
Well, here's a fun fact too. Jerry Penalosa was featured on the very first fight that ever featured Punch Zone on HBO because I was working it.
Nice.
Yeah, Jerry Penalosa against Juan Ma Lopez. So
All
like,
right.
I mean, that was the punches were. I mean, it was fucking awesome for something that we were working on for months before that, from the beginning of the year, and testing it to see finally see the light of day and to hear it too. This is our new app, Punch Zone, and blah blah blah. And then you see it, and then I felt bad for Penalosa right away because his face looked like all the colors on the. Remember the body that they had for Punch Zone, right? Where they would show the graphic and all the
Yeah, yeah.
where it was landing. Yeah, his face and body just looked like a dark plum because Juanma, beat the hell out of him. But
Dude, at his peak, Juanma Lopez was a bruiser, bro.
very much so. But Penalosa, man, for him, for a lower weight division guy to be at that level when he was considered washed all the way, well, not washed, but a little bit past it back in like '98 when he originally lost his championship to Inju Cho. He was, very consistent because he still lost a few fights here and there, but he was always still near the top, never really got blown out. And then, like you mentioned, the win over Johnny Gonzalez and everything. So,
Yeah, shit
um,
still hurts my heart.
I get it, man. That was a very sudden, and Gonzalez was winning every second of the fight, and that was just a sudden ending. And then,
Yeah, he had just a couple heartbreakers, dude. Israel Vasquez, that shit hurt my heart too.
oh,
It was
dude,
like,
man, that
oh,
poor Ray Bautista, Ponce
oh,
de Leon,
bro.
he should beat the shit. Oh man,
Oh man. Ray
that
Boom
was the
Boom
same card, right?
Batista. What's
That
that?
was the same card against Ponce de Leon, wasn't it?
Yeah, Ray Boom Boom Batista. Poor kid. I saw him fight live like 3 or 4 times before that. And I remember like, he had a lot of hype behind him. And I remember
Yeah,
cracking up because I was like, yeah, dude, I've seen this kid fight before. And everybody's like, who's he? Oh man, he took one.
that was
Poor
bad.
guy.
But all right, let's have some fun with the next one though, because I want to talk about two guys came up in the '90s. They both had
That's your
famously,
era.
man, yeah, and they were heavyweights. So we're talking Peter McNeely and Buster Mathis Jr.
There you go. Yeah, that's a pretty good set there, dude. Not gonna lie, I didn't think to bring up the Mathis brother, but the McNeelys were on my list. They
Yeah,
were on
yeah.
my list for sure. Um, yeah,
But Buster Mathis Sr., who was a well, I want to say top contender, but a contender in his day, top amateur, um, was going to be the representative of the '64 Olympics until he injured himself or whatever it was, and then Joe Frazier took over, subsequently won the gold medal. But yeah,
was gonna say, wasn't he in the first leg of that WBA tournament?
Buster Mathis Sr.?
Yeah. Now I'm gonna have to look, but maybe
I don't.
not.
I want to say no.
No, he was not.
Yeah,
Then
yeah, no.
he might have been one of. So I know that there were a couple
He was
names.
fighting those guys. He was around that era, and he was a contender to that era, fighting similar, guys. But I don't think he was a part of that tournament. He did fight Jerry Quarry, if that's what you're thinking.
I'm trying to think of what it was then, because I know that at the start of that tournament, they had initially announced like about half of the fighters that were initially announced actually went through with the tournament, and he might have been among them. But
Bonavena was
regardless, I was wrong. So yeah, Bonavena was in the tournament. He wound up beating the dude in Hamburg,
Carl Mildenberger.
Yeah, Carl Mildenberger, and then lost after that. But yeah, anyway, point is, yeah, Buster Mathis was among those contenders.
But he, Buster Mathis Sr. always had the always had that strike against him that he was overweight, blubbery, and not with a lot of heart. And he didn't really do a lot to I guess to quell all those,
like dispel that or whatever. Yeah,
dispel, exactly. That's the word, dispel. Yeah, he didn't really do anything to dispel a lot of that. Like, he showed promise. Don't get me wrong. When he fought Joe Frazier for the New York State Heavyweight Championship, not full undisputed because there was a lot going on with Ali's retirement, he outboxed Frazier for the beginning of the fight. Because look, if you put Buster Mathis Sr. and Joe Frazier together in amateur for 3-round fights, Mathis will come out as the winner 99 out of 100 times, right? I would say, I mean, it may sound weird to say, but like, that's the same.
Well, yeah, and Frazier's style wasn't made for like the amateur anyway.
Exactly.
But Mathis' style probably was.
Exactly. And as pros, when they finally met up for that championship, Mathis, the same thing. For the first 4 or 5 rounds, was outboxing Frazier thoroughly. It looked like a repeat of their amateur fights. But now we're in the pros, and Mathis is so fast. And this is an interesting thing. Like, you've seen blubbery heavyweights that can move, and Mathis was one of the early ones from back in that era. You know what I mean? Like, that people used to really joke on, because the dude had like loads on him. Like, he had
that Frankie Swindell.
Yeah, except he was taller, so he wasn't as like, he didn't have the gut that Swindell did because he was a little bit taller, but he totally had the same body shape that if he was shorter, you can notice that. You know what I mean? He had the man boobs hanging out and the gut and everything else, the side hanging, but he could move. He was slick. He was a boxer, and he was good on his feet. He had a good jab. He didn't have a ton of power, but he could outbox you. And so that's, he was, for himself, like, he probably could have did well in those Olympics, but I don't know, for whatever reason, he decided to pull out of it. And that's when Frazier, with a broken thumb nonetheless, was still able to go through and, pull out a gold medal. And yeah, he never really panned out as a pro. He had some success. He beat George Chuvalo. He beat, some other French contenders from the era. But anytime he really had to step up, he lost. He lost to Ali. He lost to Jerry Quarry. And, got knocked out by Frazier when he had the chance to fight for the title. So he kind of fell short with everything, but he was still a contender from that era. But Buster Mathis Jr., when he came through, kind of in the same mold of his dad, except a completely different style because he was trained by Customato, which you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I mean, unfortunately too, like, he wasn't really a heavy punching dude, and he was like he wasn't an unskilled guy. It's just that some fighters can fight in that style. And the problem also is that, like, he wasn't a tall dude. And so, like,
Junior? Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, but yeah, Buster Mathis Jr., he was like 6'1" or something like that. And so he wasn't a super tall guy. And then he would still come in weighing like 220, 230. And he would try to fight in that kind of what they call the peekaboo style. Yep. And, it just works for some guys, and for some other guys,
it would work for Tyson because Tyson had power to be able to fight on the inside and slip and slide and get in there and do that. If you watch Mathis, and he kind of did the, similar, and he was slick in there, he was a good fighter. He had no power.
Absolutely. That's the problem. Nothing. Yeah, that's the problem, is that even with Floyd Patterson, who himself was an undersized heavyweight, he could punch hard enough that, yes, like, you'd wobble him or you'd knock him down or whatever. But if he caught you, like, you were in deep shit. And a lot of Customado's fighters, I mean, Jose Torres wasn't quite like that, but he was just a much more skilled fighter. And so he could put it all together. Buster Mathis Jr. just could not put it together in that way. And then also, like you said, Mike Tyson had the foot speed. That was one of the key elements of Mike Tyson's success early on, was how quickly he was able to get around with his feet. And Buster Mathis Jr. was not there. Like, so he was employing that same style, only far more stationary and with no power. So it ain't gonna work.
Bringing up his record really quick just to confirm what I was thinking, in which that is that Buster Mathis Jr. also had to his advantage that he had a few fights that should have been losses, ended up being, whether it was a no decision or something or another. For instance, he had lost to, which I remember, it was Mike the Bounty Hunter, who was another awkward heavyweight from the 90s. And Hunter, I believe, was that he tested positive for something after the fight, and it was changed to a no decision. Then you remember the Riddick bullfight after that, right? Yeah. So, and he gets the bullfight, and I mean, like he's hanging in there. Bo was going through that transition that he was like being lazy and not really just going through the motions. But even so, Bo was like, I watched that live with my dad. I remember that, but I didn't really know what was going on back then. But I mean, I'm reading about it and everything. Like, Mathis is just kind of hanging in there, but Bo is clearly superior. Finally, he goes down from a combination, and then Bo hits him while he's on the ground. And instead of getting disqualified, it becomes just kind of like a draw, no decision, whatever. So Mathis is like benefiting from this. He still has an undefeated record, even though he probably should have lost a couple of times by now. And still, in him being like a safe contender, a guy with a name, Cedric Kushner promoted him, and who had a lot of pull back then. It was an easy access to get him to fight Tyson when they had that fight on Fox.
Yeah, dude, that was during a leg of Tyson's career that was not exactly prime Tyson that we're talking about in 1996.
Like shit in that fight. And for the entire fight, he was actually losing that until he finally landed that one punch that flattened Mathis. But Buster Mathis, I wanted to mention it because like he was one of those dudes. He had a career that was. He was a recognizable heavyweight during a very deep era in the 90s. He clearly wasn't going to make it to the top, but he got a lot of attention, and he got some, featured fights out of that. Because of his fight with Tyson, he got knocked out, but I mean, he put on a respectable performance that he got on Boxing After Dark soon after. And he fought Obed Sullivan. I think it was on Boxing After Dark. And then soon after that, he ended up fighting another popular undefeated heavyweight at the time, Lou Savarese. And then his career kind of faded. So,
well, and there's also another little intersection here too with one of that era's, Mike Tyson from that era too, or roughly that era, and that's, you brought up Peter McNeely.
Yes.
So I mean, like it just transitions beautifully here. That's from the 1980s, to the 1990s mullet and all, bro. Hurricane McNeely, wrap you in my cocoon.
This is for my brothers, my fathers, my sisters, Curly, Snubby,
Medfield.
And I've said it before, Bo, if that basically sums up New England in the mid-1990s, that interview right there. Everything summed up in New England mid-1990s is that Peter McNeely interview. Trust me, I lived there. I know.
You just need a couple crab cakes. Need
some lobster rolls. Yeah.
Man, yeah, dude, that's so Tom McNeely, right? Again, man, I guess Customato and his shit keeps just kind of figuring into these stories. Tom McNeely winds up fighting Floyd Patterson back in the day, right? And I mean, this is just another in the string of Customato guiding Floyd Patterson, against fighters who probably have no business being in there, but they're trying to find these like weird, interesting stories and shit like that to reasons to avoid Cleveland Williams and Sonny Liston and basically all these other Eddie Machen and far more dangerous fighters. And Tom McNeely is one of the many fighters who they've kind of dragged up from the fucking depths to face Floyd Patterson. But nonetheless, a brave guy who puts up a good effort and kind of sums up, that just a dude who did not make it over that hump whatsoever. And
probably
then
had no business fighting for the heavyweight championship.
No. A number of those, Pete Rademacher, none of those people did, dude. What the fuck were they doing in there?
I mean, bro, like imagine if Twitter was around back then, how people would have treated Customato and his conspiracy theories.
Oh my gosh, dude. Yeah, well, and yeah, I mean,
they would have absolutely tore him up, and rightfully so.
Yeah, bro.
Don't get me wrong. Like I know Customato gets a lot of love today for what he did for Tyson and everything else, and being like this guru mind and all that.
Yeah, but he's weird, bro.
Yes, and
sorry, but he's got some fucking question marks on him.
I'm sorry, bro. Like when you're heavyweight champion, Floyd Patterson's a 2-time heavyweight champion, and your best wins come after you become champion. After you become champion. You're a 2-time heavyweight champion, and your very best wins of your career become after you become champion when you get rid of him. That tells you all you need to know.
Yeah,
like
dude.
Archie Moore is a good win. Don't get me wrong, but like, look at his title reign. That just ain't,
Yeah, the title reign's bad.
It's bad. Both of them were both reigns. And then when he finally got rid of Customato, and it was like, fuck this, I'm gonna fight Sonny Liston, got through it, and then started fighting contenders and after contender and showing his worth in the late 60s up until 72 when he fought Ali in the rematch. Patterson put on some incredible performances, and he just did it on his own. Like he didn't duck anybody at that point. He fought all the top dudes. He fought all the tough guys. Got robbed sometimes. Lost.
Had a couple of close losses that he could have won.
Absolutely, but he still fought them all. You know what I mean? He was fighting Jerry Corey. He was fighting Bonavina. He was fighting George Chuvalo. Got robbed against Jimmy Ellis. He showed his worth at that point. He showed why he was a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing is like what he potentially. It was a rough break, dude. Being at the same time as a guy like Sonny Liston, that just stylistically, size wise, everything was just the worst matchup for Floyd Patterson. Like other styles he possibly could have overcome. That guy, no. It was just not going to happen for him pretty much ever. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. But yeah, like you said, dude, like in the subsequent years, he obviously proved that he was a really good fighter. But man, some of the guys that he fought during that time were so bad. And the lengths that Customato would go to protect him.
I know, exactly.
Were weird. They're fucking weird. Like to the point where like, people would be, well, anyway, whatever. Yeah, social media would have a field day. You're right on that for sure.
Imagine a guy like our guy Lefty, or any of those other or people who are very outspoken, who I respect their opinions because they make
who'd take it to these fucking ask some questions straight up.
Straight up. They would tear their ass up.
Yeah. No, there was some just kind of funky shit going on. And especially, I guess you just have to say anytime somebody loudly decrees how righteous they are all of the time, you got to start questioning it, because Customato was always talking about, the mob doesn't touch me. I'll never touch the mob, never work the mob. And I'm like,
all you got to do is show a modicum skill, and then you're automatically, you're with Lo Costra Nostra. So,
yeah, dude. So I'm just saying.
That equated Tom McNeely, brought soon after that in the very early 90s out in Medfield, birthed his son Peter, who was making the rounds of the heavyweight as a popular heavyweight. That's how I'll put it, popular heavyweight. So, and if you want to watch some of his early fights, they're on YouTube. You can find them. It's pretty hysterical. It's a typical New England, like you would see. Like if you want to see New England in the 90s, this is what it looked like on a Friday night. Everyone would go to like the VFW outlet and see a guy that Peter McNeely would bowl over in half a second. Everyone would go crazy, drink a lot of beer, get excited.
Drive home in their IROC Z.
Yes, exactly. Oh, yeah, totally. So McNeely scored a bunch of wins, getting very popular around the area in New England in general. And I don't want to use a stereotype, but it's always true. Whenever a white heavyweight gets a lot of momentum and everyone gets really excited, gets a lot of noise going around them, people get interested, especially a Don King, who is still very active in the 90s and is looking for a fighter like that to, make money with. So
it's that exact scene from The Great White Hype, bro.
Yes, totally.
Where they're watching videos of white boys who are like that. That's
and I love that they showed real clips. That they showed like Ardris Eklund getting shot by
Tim Witherspoon.
Yeah. So, and then they were commenting on it too, like,
ooh,
yeah. Oh man, I saw that, and he was like, "Oh, you were at this fight, Julio, South Africa, Julio, really?" They're like, but anyways. So McNeely was getting a lot of prominence. So of course Don King came sniffing around because he saw an easy bait for either Mike Tyson or Oliver McCall. Originally, he had plans because he wasn't sure when Tyson was going to get out or whatever it may be, that McCall was going to defend against Peter McNeely in the recently renovated Boston Garden. So that was his whole scheme. They were going to put that on there, which would have been an absolute fiasco of epic proportions because McCall would have
Atomic Bull. Yeah,
McCall would have killed him. Then he would have talked a lot of shit on the mic, and all the drunk, Bostonians would have lost their mind and probably destroyed the place before the Celtics even got to play there. So that's what you're looking at. Instead, McNeely ended up fighting Mike Tyson, and all the infamous quotes and everything that we love, went through from that.
Hey, go get the car, Peter. Peter.
But to McNeely's credit, man, he ended up getting that Pizza Hut commercial afterwards where he got knocked out by the pepperoni slice.
I remember that. Yeah, I mean, that shit's on YouTube, but I remember that from the time. Like at the time.
How can you not?
That shit was national, bro. I remember that shit at the time, yeah. Nah,
And his face too, bro, when he was standing, Tyson's eyes going back and forth. You see McNeely with that dopey grin.
Yeah. Like this guy just does not know what's happening to him in about 90 seconds. Oh,
I had my whole family. I had a bunch of uncles and cousins over to watch that. I'm sure that was around television sets all over the country.
Oh yeah, we got that shit. I remember we got that shit, and of course it was like, we got that shit, and then moments later, I think it was like my stepdad was just like bunch of fucking bullshit, something like that. Oh yeah, because we didn't have a black box.
Yeah, we had a black box. No one complained.
Yeah, we didn't have a black box. I don't know if my mom would have gone for my mom would have been like, I've heard people get arrested for that. My mom would have said some shit.
I was sworn to secrecy, bro. I was not allowed to talk about the black box. My parents.
I would have. Trust me, I would have been great.
Yeah.
I would have loved to but we didn't. But we ordered that shit. But it was like moments later. It was like a bunch of fucking shit. That's why boxing. Yeah, that's fixed. That type of shit. But I mean, but Peter McNeely, dude, like, I guess he really was only popular in the Northeast. Like I can't really ever say that I've seen a lot of,
no, he was a New England guy, man. Look.
Yeah, before he got the Tyson shot, you know what I mean? Like there might've been a couple of TV spots before then, but 90s, he was not
when McNeely was coming to prominence. All right. The Celtics at that point were like going through a tailspin. They weren't trying to win any championships and they were struggling in the playoffs. Patriots were fucking garbage at that point. I'm not a football fan, but I can tell you from all accounts of my uncles and everyone else, they sucked.
I can actually back that up, and that's only because there was a classmate of mine right around that time who wore like Patriots gear every single day, and every day it was like 5th, 6th grade. She used to get like clowned for it like daily.
I'm sure, yeah, man. Also, not bringing us to prominence like Tom Brady would. All right, so
true story.
It was only till the early 2000s when we turned everything around. And then I don't follow hockey, but I would assume I would have known if the Boston Bruins were doing any business back then. They would have made some news. So we had Peter McNeely. That's what we had, okay? We didn't have
all our hopes. All our New England hopes rested on Peter McNeely.
I mean, Mickey Ward didn't really, build anything until the late 90s himself, all right? In 1994, 95, that's what everybody's hope was on, was Peter McNeely. And trust me, people, go on YouTube. Type in Peter McNeely interviews from before the Tyson fight. Everybody in Medfield and that whole section of Massachusetts actually thought he was going to win. All right? It wasn't even BS. You interview him, oh, yeah, I think Peter's going to pull it off. We had nothing else to believe in back there.
That's rough, dude. That's
I'm
rough.
just keeping it real, man. I'm from a person who was born and raised in New England. I know how it was in the 90s.
Oh man, you're about to be disowned. All these fools who are rooting for McNeely at the time are about to disown your ass.
I mean,
Yeah,
I gotta keep it real, man. I love Hurricane Pete, but
definitely one of the greatest, like, 90s characters for sure.
totally, man.
No
I'm glad that
question.
he was able to parlay that, blitz from Tyson into some money with the Pizza Hut and whatever else.
Yeah,
He knocked himself into history. Good for Pete.
a definite fucking goofball. That's for sure. So let's see. I will take it to the UK. I will take this one to the UK. I'm going to say Jack London. No, not that Jack London. The fighter Jack London and Brian London.
Oh, okay.
So, I guess for whatever reason, I just never put two and two together. Like I know of both of them.
Jack London, the promoter?
No,
Oh,
no, Jack London. There was the writer Jack London, the American writer.
yeah, no. Oh, no, I'm thinking of someone else. I'm sorry.
Jack
Yeah,
Solomons, you might be thinking of.
yeah, something like that.
Mr. Boxing, the London promoter. That
Yeah.
might be what you're thinking of. But in any case, Jack London, I knew of him and I knew of Brian London, obviously, but I never really put it together that they were related. So Jack London, Brian London's father. Jack London was a 1940s Commonwealth British heavyweight champion. And then Brian was it's actually the amount of time that separated their careers was actually kind of remarkably small. But if you look at the photos of Jack London, the dude looks like, I don't know, he basically looks like the dude who plays Vizzini in The Princess Bride. Like he's like bald and he looks like Bob Fitzsimmons. Just like he looks like somebody who's just your corner store fucking guy. Like he does not look like a fighter whatsoever. But in any case, well, I'll get to Brian in a moment. Jack defeated Freddie Mills, Larry Gaines, the Toronto
Larry
Terror.
Gaines is a very good fighter.
The Toronto Terror, Larry Gaines, underrated, but he was also what's that?
Knocked out Max Schmeling.
That's right. He was also unfortunately defeated soundly by a smaller Tommy Loughran, and he was knocked out by Bruce Woodcock. But Brian was the Commonwealth British heavyweight champion in the late 1950s. Jack had only been retired for about 5 or 6 years when Brian won the ABA heavyweight title in 1955. But obviously, Brian London, he got a lot farther than Jack London. He beat Willie Pastrano, Zora Foley, Tom McNeely, we were just talking about. But he also beat Jim Cooper, who was Henry Cooper's twin. And he wound up paying dearly for that because Henry Cooper kicked the shit out of Brian London 3 times, knocked him out the first time, and then decisioned him the next 2 times. And so anyway, they both kind of ended up more on like I guess you could say journeyman end of the spectrum, but Brian definitely took more chances than his dad did, and also in a better division. Mm-hmm. So that accounts for far more losses, I think. But I guess his claim to fame, Brian London, that is fighting Muhammad Ali in 1966, and also being the recipient of a punch in a really famous photograph of Muhammad Ali, catching a dude, and the guy's like, ooh, his face is all distorted. That's Brian London.
Oh man, well, London, yeah, exactly. London was one of those guys. He was a heavyweight contender from his time, and not a bad fighter, but a dude that again had a ceiling for where he was going to be at. And if anytime he was going to really be stepped up, he was going to get blasted out pretty spectacularly because he had the greatest chin. Patterson knocked him out. There's a famous photo of him laying on the canvas after Patterson flattened him. It was not laying on it, but he's kind of like on the ropes, sort of like looking out, just completely bewildered and done. And then the same thing with Ali, but he wasn't a bad guy at that time. But that was a really good one because that wasn't something I really thought of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that they both came into the British heavyweight title in somewhat fortunate circumstances too. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like they obviously only topped out as like the best regionally where they were as the British heavyweight champion, because they never got beyond really that level for the most part. I mean, defeating Zorafoli, even if it's like not a great version of Zorafoli, is still an
That's still a
accomplishment.
big win, man, because Zorafoli was a criminally underrated
He's a
contender.
very, very good fighter. So it's, that's not nothing.
Another one of the Plastamato somehow associated with the mob, aka you're too good of a fighter to fight Floyd.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. At that point, I think
hard to remember exactly, actually.
Yeah, dude. It's he's should be talked about far more, no question. Zorafoli,
especially because of his death too, man. We should do a podcast on that one day.
I was actually thinking about that the other day. We'll get to that one. We got to go A to Z. He's at the end.
All right, so here's go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, as far as the circumstances, Jack London wound up. I think it was Len Harvey like relinquished the British heavyweight title or something like that, and then Jack London wound up defeating it on like a split decision or something like that, and then lost it in his first defense. And then Brian London wound up defeating, I want to say it was Joe Erskine, who was the guy that Henry Cooper just absolutely fucking, obliterated like awfully. And then anyway, long story short, I think that they both topped out at that certain level, but even then we're kind of like just barely chugga got there. So anyway, yeah, I figured that would be a good one that we probably wouldn't bring up otherwise.
Well, here's another one too that I'm not sure if you would have thought of. What was the first father-son combo to fight on the same card?
Give me a second. I know it. Give me a second. Oh, dude, because someone brought this trivia up like years ago and I didn't know it and learned it.
Might have been me, actually.
it honestly might have been you. Oh shit. I don't know it. I don't know.
The last name is Mosley. Rocky Mosley Sr. and Jr.
Damn. Okay. No, I did not know that.
I'm not gonna go like in depth with this, but that was the first. Because when Shane Mosley was talking about him and his kid fighting, they're like, "Oh, we're making history." First off, that wasn't not even close to being the first time that a father and son fought in the same.
It wasn't even the first Mosley.
Yeah, and it wasn't even the first Mosleys to do it. Yeah.
That's fucking.
Hilarious. Yeah, man. In 1975. Rocky Mosley Sr. lost to Mike Lancaster while Rocky Jr. knocked out Al Foster. Rocky Mosley Sr. was a guy that fought from like he was like active in the late 50s and the 60s up until he got murdered in the late 70s. But he was a dude that was like featured, kind of a mysterious fighter. Not a lot out there on him. Trust me, I've tried to look, but a guy that fought out in Vegas and other stuff. His record is probably incomplete. But didn't have a winning record, but I mean, was a veteran that fought a lot of guys and, fought around the area and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff shrouded with him. There's stories, there's other hearsay there and there, but like a lot of fighters from that era that there's not a lot documented on. It's more so just stories as opposed to like concrete evidence of what's been written about him. But what's been known is that, he was a decent fighter. He wasn't bad. His record is totally incomplete because we don't really know besides what BoxRec has for, actually confirmed fights. I'm sure there's a lot more out there on that. And especially when he was competing in Vegas and other outposts in that era, there probably wasn't a lot of record keeping going on. So there's
what years was it?
Probably in the late 50s, early.
That would have been pretty early for Vegas then.
Yeah. Let's see right now, actually, so I can click. Yeah, 57 to 1977.
Yeah, so, that would have been pretty early for Vegas then. Yeah, for sure.
So I'm it definitely wasn't that, a lot of stuff that he was going through and everything like that probably wasn't documented as much. His kid, though, Rocky Mosley Jr., was a contender in the junior middleweight divisions in the late 70s up until the early 80s. And I think won like an NABF title, USBA, one of those titles that still had prominence back then. And was a good all-around fighter.
Nice. That's one I 100% definitely would not have brought up for sure.
No, I just it's just like a cool piece of trivia. I even stumped
for sure
at one time. I didn't even know there was a Rocky Mosley Sr.
I should probably fucking write that down somewhere. When I go through and edit this, I'll probably write that down. That is good trivia for sure. I feel like you told me that before, but
Yeah, I'm sure we brought it up. But there's really like Rocky Mosley as any guy that there's not a lot of stuff on, but I know they had like a sketchy past and they had a bad ending and whatever. I want to know more about it.
yeah,
And when
totally.
there's not a lot on the internet about them, besides like what they have on BoxRec, which is just kind of exactly right here. When you look at you go on BoxRec, you look at his first thing. Mosley's entire career is a mystery. Career record is a mystery. A young man during the Beat generation. Um, Mosley traveled around boxing in various locations throughout the United States. Mosley's favorite spots were Las Vegas of the 1950s and 60s and Alaska. Many of his fights did not find their results way to the local papers of the Ring Record Book.
Damn. All right.
So,
Okay. I mean, yeah, I would say Alaska is certainly not a boxing locale, generally speaking. So that's yeah, that's I would say that's for sure a fucking that's off the beaten path. And yeah, in that era, Las Vegas definitely was not
Vegas and Alaska. That's where he was hanging out around.
wowzas. So. Yo, dude, that's like the second most prominent Alaskan boxing figure, second to Tex Rickard when he was chilling there for a gold rush and shit. Yeah, that's good shit, dude. That's good trivia for sure.
Yeah.
Let's see, I got a decent one here mostly because there was some backstory that I honestly didn't even know about. So they're actually Wilfredo Vasquez Sr. and Wilfredo Vasquez Jr. It's a pretty decent father-son combo. I'll fairly briefly go through the story. This is actually on Wilfredo Vasquez Wikipedia page, which is surprising. And I initially was like, yeah, I'm questioning this because this sounds like a bunch of bullshit. But it actually was, it cited the citation is a book that was written about the history of Puerto Rican boxing. So I'm kind of like, all right, I'm inclined to believe it then. But regardless, that doesn't mean it's true. But regardless, according to urban legend here, urban Wikipedia legend, Wilfredo Vasquez was not a fighter until he was about 18 years old. And he began training because his father had died, and his father had died because he was a big fan or follower of Wilfredo Gomez. And at that time, Wilfredo Gomez was about to have a fight against Carlos Zarate, and that he had bought tickets for Gomez Zarate and had died like the following day or something like that. And so Wilfredo Vasquez, his son, wound up taking up boxing shortly after that. And yeah, he just motivated himself.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, I didn't know that story whatsoever. So he motivated himself, and he, as an amateur, fought 17 times, went 14-3, and didn't wind up pursuing a spot on Puerto Rico's national boxing team because of his age at the time. And he turned professional instead. And yeah, long story short, he wound up actually getting a title shot that he lost, but against Miguel Happy Laura.
Happy Laura. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was probably a somewhat underrated fighter, although I see his name pop up fairly frequently on the International Boxing Hall of Fame ballot. And it's unfortunate because it's like his record cannot compare to a number of the people, that are more worthy, but nonetheless, a very underrated fighter. I want to say Colombian, I think. And in any case, he winds up losing that fight, but he became the WBA bantamweight champion in 1987 when he beat Park Chen-Yang. And it was, yeah, I think a really big emotional culmination for him to be able to kind of honor his father in that regard, but also, become another Puerto Rican champion, adding to the long list of great champions from Puerto Rico. And then he also captured the junior featherweight champion after that. And in any case, became a very good fighter, was fairly prominent on TV during the late 80s and a handful of times during the early 90s.
Yeah, he was featured on HBO and Showtime. Absolutely. I watched him.
Yeah, actually, considering, considering the fact that he was bantamweight to featherweight, actually got a fair bit of play, all things considered. Like mostly those fighters don't get a whole lot of featured, but that's kind of the cutoff. That featherweight is like the cutoff.
Well, like I remember the first time I saw him was against Orlando Canizales, when Canizales moved up from bantamweight to challenge him and then lost. And I saw him against was it Rojas? Elio Rojas, was it right?
I think so, yeah.
Which he scored a coming from behind knockout and ended up being the knockout of the year.
Yeah, that was that was an absolutely rough, like, woof.
Oh my god, man! Yeah, like with the way Mitch Halpern catches that dude, when
like you almost don't even see it, but you almost don't even see it, and then you see it like he like comes around him, like blah.
He comes around him and hits him. I'll never forget that as a kid watching that, because I literally thought that was when I saw Halpern.
That was Halpern being so good that he anticipated that fool was getting blasted.
Yes.
Caught him mid combination. He still got blasted anyway.
Bro, when I was a kid, I thought that was Halpern's hand hitting his head, because the way it goes around, it looks like his head snaps back. It looks like Halpern actually hit him.
Yeah.
Like it's it's crazy. And then when he fought Hamed, obviously on HBO. So
yeah, that was obviously, right toward I guess kind of like the end of his effectiveness as a fighter or whatever. But that was yet another case of not that much time separating when he was actually a world ranked fighter and when his son got into the game. I mean, like, this is actually pretty remarkable how quickly the turnaround was there, because Wilfredo Vasquez Jr. wound up becoming now I have to look because I want to make sure, but he was, I want to say, the WBO junior featherweight champion. He had an incredible fight with Jorge Arce in 2011.
I remember that.
Yeah. Brutal back and forth fight that was ended like kind of last second with Arce scoring the knockout.
He definitely recovered from that. That was a brutal fight.
Yeah, he had a couple of pretty good outings, and he actually managed to give Nonito Donaire some shit in their fight. Like, I think stylistically it was just a really bad match for Nonito in some of the rounds. But yeah, he never really quite got back to form after that. And not that he would necessarily be expected to, man. That was a really brutal fight. I got to give him credit, though, because he's always kind of been, from what I've seen, the kind of fighter that's just a serious pain in the ass to deal with. Like, powerful enough that like you don't want to stand around and get hit by him, but also stylistically the kind of guy who's like, he's going to find you like with his punches one way or another. And that, to me, it's not like I had a ton of experience in the ring, but it's like, you don't want to get hit. And then also on top of not wanting to get hit, it's like when you feel you can avoid getting hit and a guy finds you anyway.
Yeah.
That shit is one of the most frustrating fucking things. And he always, for whatever reason, he gave me that impression when I watched him. And anyway, he was a pretty fun fighter to watch for the most part.
No, absolutely, man. Both father and son. And,
yeah, that's true.
I remember when Arce stopped him. Do you remember when Vasquez Jr. walked back to his corner? His dad kind of like threw water on his face and just went like threw his hands up at him, like saying it's over.
I like, don't actually know. I'd have to look
at that. It's kind of like kind of cut it off. I mean, like, he got stopped, but like Vasquez Sr. like wrapped it around him. Yeah,
it's unfortunate. Yeah, I mean like,
and like I'll say this though, his kid was a good fighter, and he did reach more than what people expected. He had some good wins, and in the early mid 2010s, he was making like some noise.
Yeah, so. Highly respectable. Yeah. And like you said, a lot of people brushed him off coming up for sure, but highly respectable.
All right. Well, I want to veer off, on my last one here. So we mentioned not just like the sons of fighters.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the early 2000s when all of a sudden it became popular of the daughters of former champions, heavyweight champions specifically, to become pros. We're talking Layla Ali, who went on to become probably the most prominent one, Jackie Frazier-Lyde, the late Frida Foreman, and even Ingmar Johansson's daughter. Do you remember that?
I don't. Wow.
She did. Yeah, man. Ignamar Johansson's daughter. I watched it on, I think, Fox Sports or some shit. And she turned pro for one fight, or might have been a couple of fights, but whatever fight I watched of hers, I think it was her pro debut, and she got whooped on with Ingo Bingo ringside.
Ay, rough, dude.
But like the early 2000s, when a bunch of daughters, like, that became like the wave all of a sudden.
Yeah, dude. I mean, yes, I remember that very well. I was never really a big fan of Layla Ali, and not because I didn't like her or like I had nothing against her or what, I mean, like, dude, one thing that I guess I haven't really said throughout this episode, and I guess I'm just going to grandstand here for a moment, get on my pedestal, but it's like, you can't choose your family. You can't choose the family that you're born into. And you can't choose like the people that you love and love you and all that type of stuff, right? So like I don't want to like trash people for being boxing families or from like the son or a daughter of like a world champion or something like that, but I just never really liked the fact that, for the same reason that everybody else said, that she was afforded the chances because of her name, Layla Ali specifically, and was fighting overmatched, super crappy opponents all of the time. I mean, there was no choice. Like the opposition just wasn't there, and it's okay. Like I get it, but I'm just saying, like for the exact same reasons, I was not really a fan. And also I was like not really entirely sure how good she was, because the fighters that she was fighting were that bad. So it was like, I remember feeling at the time like kind of resentful, kind of like, what the fuck is this? Like, what am I having to watch this here for? But again, looking back, it's like, she did what she could. I get it.
She wasn't a bad fighter. So like Ali's nephew, I remember, was the first one that tried it. Ibn Ali was his name, because I met him at the Hall of Fame, me and my best friend. And he looked like his uncle, talked like him, had the whole thing going on. We were hanging out with him, we were messing with him and all that. He was cool. But he didn't pan out as a pro at all, right? And when Layla came on the scene, everybody, oh my God, it's Ali's daughter, yada yada yada. And obviously the women's boxing scene in general, probably in terms of talent wise and everything else, isn't as good as it is today, right? Because we're talking still like this Straight is the late 90s, early 2000s.
Well, and as a rule, the higher up in weight you get, the worse the opposition is. And that's just how it is.
Still today, that still stands.
Yeah, totally.
So think about it when Layla came on the scene around 99, 2000, 2001, whatever it was, right? Like, because we're still talking, when Christy Martin was like beating up just absolute people had no business being in the ring with her on Showtime. So when you see Layla Ali's early fights, totally the same thing. These girls have just straight up just being brought up from the bar or wherever they're coming from, have no business being in the ring fighting someone who has.
Yeah, some of them like barely even holding their, like not even like holding their hands up. No idea what they're
doing. Yeah, her first few fights, absolutely not. But to her credit, she turned into a really, really good fighter. And I mean, not as a really, really good, but I mean like a good enough fighter that like she was fighting other credible opponents of her time, like Valerie Mahfoud and a few others from that era that were like decent fighters, and she was beating them and like looking good at it. I mean, of course, we all wish she would have fought Ann Wolfe when they had the chance, but it is what it is.
I remember even calls for her to fight Lucia Riker, who was, I want to say, a welterweight at the time.
Well, yeah,
but they were just like, put Lucia in there with her,
Absolutely, yeah. Instead, she fought Christy Martin.
Yeah.
But like, it was interesting when she turned pro. All of a sudden, Joe Frazier's daughter, Jackie Frazier, had to turn pro soon after that because she had to take the thing. And then George Foreman's daughter, Frida, wanted to turn pro as well. And then Ingo's daughter. Like, it was crazy to see that it was like this whole little thing that, like, for like a year where everybody started turning pro, and then it was like everybody started giving attention to it.
Yeah, at least with Layla, you could tell she studied, she trained, she developed, she improved.
And she had good trainers too. She wasn't like with a bad camp or anything. She actually like took it seriously.
And so yeah, I'm not going to walk back what I said about the resentment, but I have to admit that she did improve. She did get better. Yeah. She did show that she was serious. and it's not her fault the opposition was so bad, like she can't
It was the
create.
era.
Yeah, and you can't create good opponents that when they don't exist. But regardless, yeah, you could tell that she definitely got better. Jackie Frazier lied was like, what was she doing? Like she
I
just
was
basically.
there. I was there at the Hall of Fame when they fought at the Turning Stone.
Oh yeah.
Age of 4, yeah.
Yeah, dude, I remember that. And I mean, it was like, yeah, I get it. You're like a working class lady, you're getting into this too, but it was like at least with Layla Ali, she was a real fighter. And then
Mhm.
with these other fighters, they was like all a money grab. I mean, it was
It
unfortunate.
totally was, man. I feel bad for George and what happened with his family with Frida and everything, and
Yeah.
but Ingo's daughter, man, she was bad. Like, I don't know why she decided what it was or anything, but poor Johansson. I just remember they zoned in on ringside. He just had this look on his face, like, what the fuck,
Yeah,
know what
bro,
I mean?
isn't boxing like banned in Sweden now? Like, I don't even know if
I think
pro
it might
boxing
be.
is a
Yeah, I'm
thing.
not even entirely sure, but like the fight took place in the U.S. It wasn't. It
Yeah,
wasn't.
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Is like she probably is like it's like
No, but she got whooped on.
boxing.
She got whooped. Like
Oh,
got beat up.
rough.
And he was just kind of sitting there like, with his eyes all like agape and shit. So
She got
like,
that tunder, man.
yeah, right. But that was
Yeah.
just an interesting time. Like I remember that was the thing. Oh yeah, man, former heavyweight champions, their daughters are turning pro. Ali Frazier 4. Because they made that the main event of the Boxing Hall of Fame weekend at the Turning Stone. On the undercard was Tim Witherspoon, Monty Barrett.
Well, and a lot of people don't know that Rahman Ali also was a fighter. Like that
Yes,
Muhammad
Ali's
Ali's brother.
brother. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And
yeah,
he fought on a few cards as Ali too. Obviously he didn't pan out like him, but he was definitely put up the name.
yeah. He was obviously, he was an okay fighter, but it
Okay, that's
was,
the word to put it.
yeah, like it was
Clearly
mostly
had
that.
a limit because when he ever, not even stepping up to fringe contenders, like
Yeah,
slightly
nah.
journeyman, he still lost to. Yeah.
And I think it was pretty clear. But he used to get in, and they used to do sparring exhibitions and shit like that every so often, and he used to train with Muhammad pretty frequently. But yeah, I mean, yeah,
I mean, it goes all the way back, bro. Like, I'm not gonna go into detail, but you had Billy Papke, who had a whole other, crazy
yeah, that's a good one.
early century middleweight champ, turn of the century middleweight champion. Had his wars with Ketchel and others of the era. His son turned pro, completely nondescript, never really did much. Marcel Cerdan, former
That's a good
middleweight
one. Yeah,
champion. We know the story of him and everything like that. His kid turned pro. His kid was actually had some success. Was rated by the Ring magazine at one point, but again, never really rose past that and became, he never fought for a championship, let alone, being like a really, really ranked contender. But it's always one of those type of things, man. When you can try to go back, you just want to try to follow in the footsteps of your dad. There's certain guys today. Hasim Rahman Jr. is a pro. Fernando Vargas's kid is trying it. Evander Holyfield's kid, like they're all over. So
yeah. I had a list, and I knew that we weren't going to get to them, but I'll just kind of rattle off a handful of them. Alejandro Cobrita Gonzalez Sr. and Alejandro Gonzalez Jr., who unfortunately was murdered in 2016.
yeah, that was
But
one.
he had that great and surprising fight with Carl Frampton a couple of years ago.
Absolutely,
That was a lot of fun. And again, surprising. There's Jorge Paez and Jorge Paez Jr.
that's right. Yep,
And also Azrael Paez was also Jorge Paez, his son. I got to
Howard
see
Davis's kid.
what's that?
Howard Davis's kid.
That's true. Yeah. Well, and actually, before we were talking about Floyd Patterson, Tracy Harris Patterson.
Yes, yes.
Forgot
Absolutely.
about him too. I got to see Mauro Merito, Jorge Paez Jr. fight live a handful of times. Once in San Diego because he was being handled by Zanfer and Siquan.
Mm-hmm.
But let's see what else. Aaron Pryor Jr., but also Stefan Pryor.
That's right.
Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. and Jr.,
Oh,
and
wow.
also, of course, Omar Chavez. The whole Mayweather family, Floyd Mayweather Sr., Jeff Mayweather, Roger Mayweather, and of course, Floyd Mayweather Jr. We talked about the Spinks brothers, McNeely's. let's see. Oh, and also, yeah, I forgot Tom McNeely Sr. too, because Tom McNeely Jr. was the one who fought Floyd Patterson. There was a Tom McNeely Sr. who was a heavyweight in the 1930s, but he was like, what's it? Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, and also another one, the first father-son duo to get knocked out by the same guy, Harold Johnson, Senior and Junior, got knocked out by Jersey Joe Walcott.
Yeah.
That's
that one I did know. That might have been what I was connecting then. But one that I kind of wished that I would have thought of earlier, Tony Mundine and Anthony Mundine would have been fun to talk about.
That's a really, really good one. Good call.
Yeah, Tony Mundine challenged Carlos Monzon in the 1970s. Anthony
was just a long time middleweight contender that had a long career.
A very good fighter and a guy respected in Australian boxing. Mm-hmm. Anthony Mundine, on the other hand, got knocked out brutally by Sven Otke. He did do other things like piss everyone off constantly.
I'm sorry, man, but you got like imagine getting one punch by fucking 4 knockouts. Feather fist Aki, and you're winning the fight.
Yeah, I remember that at the time because everyone was like, "Oh, he's super athletic. He's like a rugby player, all sorts of shit." And I was like, "How well could he possibly do?" And he did do well. And then all of a sudden, it was just like the lightest punch on the face of the planet, totally knocked him cold, senseless, dead to the world. It's a mystery.
That's the career of Aki.
Kazunori Ioka, who was a very prominent Japanese promoter. Yes. Mm-hmm. Hiroki Ioka, his son, champion. Kazuto Ioka, also his son, champion. Guti Espadas and Guti Espadas Jr.
Yeah. Both were champions.
Yep. Hector Camacho, Felix Camacho, and Hector Camacho Jr. Faklan Sakriran and Tirfong Utalda, aka Faklan Sakriran Jr., both world champions. Nigel Benn and Connor Benn, Chris Eubank and Chris Eubank Jr., Alan Minter and Ross Minter, Ronald Hearns and Thomas Hearns.
I forgot that one. Yep.
Julian Jackson, Julius Jackson, and John Jackson.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's all I wrote down because
bro. If you're gonna go from like big names or everything,
that I was like, okay, we're scraping the barrel here. I need to stop.
But honestly, like the way we broke it down today, I think we went in depth with the ones that we did. We're good. So. Yeah,
dude. I mean, I think we hit most of the big ones, most of the important ones. I'm, like I said earlier, we're not going to be able to hit all of them, dude. We only got so much time, and we're not built that way, dude. If you tuned in this entire time, can probably understand we go off on little, tangents and stuff like that we remember and fun little tidbits just because that's how it is, dude. Hey, man, I appreciate it, dude. A lot of fun.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun today. Absolutely.
And speaking of which, if you did listen in or watch, we appreciate you. Thank you so much. If you would subscribe on YouTube, that is helpful. Go ahead and leave a comment too if you want to hear something else from us or have any requests as far as topics. Also helpful. But if you listened in via some sort of podcast app, whatever it is, also subscribe, leave us a comment or rating. Helpful in that regard. As far as social media goes, we're all up on there, Facebook and Instagram. But if you are on Twitter, follow my boy Aris Pina at Punch Zone Aris. Follow me at Patrick M. Connor. If I can figure out my own name, we'll see about that. But Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Take it easy, everybody.